past month or so, I've been working diligently on setting up a 5.1 studio setup, implemented it as a 4 because I don't need a center channel and I don't need a subwoofer, given the quality of my monitors and my existing studio setup. But anyway, I have essentially finished or completed that setup, and as a consequence of completing that and doing various listening tests, I came to the conclusion, I actually posted on my private Facebook timeline about it and posted my conclusions and my sentiments about the quality of 5.1 material, which is basically that I'm very impressed with what you get out of your typical reasonable production standard DVD movies. But when it comes to DVDs on live music soundtracks, the quality in my eyes, or my ears more to the point, not my eyes, the sound quality I found wanting and lacking, typically muddy, lacking definition, various coloration issues, whatever. And I was just lamenting that fact, and I guess you would say one of the people in my friend space chimed in and listed off the vast number of reasons why this is so from his perspective, having worked as a sound engineering professional, I guess you could say, and knowing lots of sound engineering professionals. And I lamented the fact that, yeah, well, that may be true, but then my experience from using Harbel speaks to the contrary, and I can actually easily fix up most of those issues. Not perfectly, obviously, but make substantial improvements in the quality of the presentation of the sound using the software that I've developed. And again, there's to and fro continued on for a reasonable number of exchanges with no ultimate conclusion being reached, which is my common experience with shall we say sound recording, engineering, mastering, whatever, mixing professionals who don't have the experience with a piece of software like Harbel that I do, and are blissfully unaware of what it's capable of. And it's compounded by the fact that, well, let's say you may find that maybe one of these music professionals or sound recording professionals is bold enough to actually try out the software, but they try out the software from a perspective of what they're familiar with and the way that they work. And just like, I don't know, just like a carpenter and his tools, you can give anybody the tools of a carpenter, but whether they can actually construct something of quality or not will depend on their skills. And if their skills are associated with equipment that has no bearing to Harbel, obviously they're not going to exercise it to its fullest potential. And anyway, in one of my closing remarks, I actually pointed out that can't remember exactly how I phrased it, but if you find any of this hard to believe, then simply put me to the challenge. You can send me anything that you find untreatable in a whatever 2-channel stereo format that you find virtually impossible to make inroads into improving the quality of through traditional mastering processes. And of course it was met with a stony silence, which is my typical response, well, my typical experience of that sort of a response or that sort of offer. So it went nowhere. So this video in essence is my response to his lack of response in demonstrating that it is indeed possible. So, provided that I don't get a takedown notice because I'm using copyrighted material, I shall attempt to show you a couple of examples. The first example I'll show comes from this. Let's get it in a position where you can see it. This landmark live recording of I guess a pretty famous Smiths concert back in the 80s, and the song I remastered on this that I'll be showing you is The Boy with a Thorn in His Side. And essentially I loaded the track up in Harbel and I designed a filter from scratch in literally 15 minutes. And to tell you the truth, 90% of what I did in terms of designing that filter for that particular track, I did entirely without listening to the track, which is typically the way I work anyway. So I'll do most of the work track unheard. Well, I'll qualify that. I do actually listen to a track from end to end before I even embark on remastering, because I want to have a clear impression of what I feel are the issues with that recording, and knowing that offhand and seeing what I see in the track spectrum gives me a clear indication of the way I should be going about fixing a particular track. But in this case, after listening to the track and looking at what I see in Harbel, I spent literally around about 10 to 15 minutes constructing a filter. Then after constructing the filter, I actually played it back to myself, made minor adjustments to get it to the place where I wanted it to be, and that was that. Now, from a producer's point of view, in terms of producing quality musical content or music content, DVDs, whatever, if it literally takes that little effort to substantially improve the quality, then why not do it? And that is essentially my entire point that I was trying to make to this particular individual who wasn't buying it, because from his experience it's simply not possible to essentially what sounds like remixing but isn't actually remixing a track from a 2-track source, or in case of a DVD, a 5.1 source. But I haven't actually made the software modifications to my software to be able to cope with that sort of content at this point in time, and that was half the motivation for, or a substantial motivation for building a 5.1 system anyway, so I'll have something to test with when I get around to actually doing it. So that's the first example. A second example, I've forgotten the name of the track. What was it? That's right. Comes from a now defunct acid jazz band from Australia. I think they were mainly operating in I guess mid 80s to the early 90s, called Bachelors from Prague, and the track is called Gin and Ice. And again, I spent about 10 to 15 minutes constructing the filter and then making minor adjustments while listening to it afterwards. And the other thing I would say regarding these filter designs, which is generally true of most of the recorded material that I have worked with, is that there's a clear cutoff in time, a fairly clear cutoff in time, that for recordings done prior to, say, around about 1990, actually remastering them is a pretty straightforward and simple job. But then beyond 1990, it's not impossible, it's still doable, perfectly doable, but it becomes considerably more complicated. And fundamentally, the reason why that complication arises is, well, a couple of issues. One is the introduction of brick wall limiting, over limiting of tracks. But the other major issue is the adoption of, post-1990, the use of multi-band compression, and then more recently that has become what they now refer to as dynamic EQ. And why that presents a problem in remastering material, which normally wouldn't be a problem in older material, is the very nature of those particular processes is that it varies in time with the content. So the statistics, the underlying statistics in the spectrum of the track then suddenly goes from being less time varying to more time varying, and in a fairly ad hoc and potentially problematic way. So invariably what you have to do for those sorts of tracks is you have to split them up on song structure basis and then process each individually, and spend quite a bit of time getting the colour of the sound to maintain a good uniformity across all the different sections that you've created in your filter, which is why working with more modern recordings, I find, is typically more challenging, simply because of the additional processing that has been imposed on them during the mastering phase. So if you've got a problematic recording, they'll try and fix it with dynamic EQ or multi-band compression, and it just makes the whole process of fixing it with Harbel more complicated. But anyway, that's pretty much it as far as my examples go. And now I'll play you those two example cases for you to actually evaluate for yourself. And then you can decide whether I'm actually dreaming, imagining things, not knowing fact from fiction, whatever, insulting me, whatever. It's all it's all quite bizarre, but certainly from my perspective and from my ears, there's a very clear and obvious benefit having been obtained by post-processing it with a relatively small amount of effort on my part in Harbel.
lost my balance, out of control. I took 3 chances, so my soul. The wrong corner, I lost my way. We are one jet, I gotta pay. Now it's the city, the lights are lying. Oh, what a pity, it's not surprising. It's not London, that's for sure. I wanna come down, hit the bar. The game is waiting, I got no dice, and to anticipating I tune eyes. I play my own hand, keep these, dig the lowdown out of place. Together is just a waste. Getting it together is just a waste. I lost my balance, out of control. I took 3 chances, down out of place. Day by day, it's the same old case. How about just to and from? Getting it together is just a waste. Getting it together is just a waste.
So how is it possible that you can re-equalize a track and make it sound like it's been remixed in Harbel? Easy way to describe that. Let's just consider the spectrum of 2 instruments. Okay. We'll start with let's say we had 2 different guitar parts that have a peaked sort of response in terms of a spectrum. Something like that for 1, for instance. And then my orange one doesn't work. Where's my green one? And then say there's one that looks like this for the other one. So how can I actually affect a remix of that? Because what I see in Harbel, if this were an average spectrum, looks like this basically. Oops, missed a bit there. So it looks like that. So if I now go about boosting these peaks here, these low ones, I end up with effectively what I've done now is I've raised the level of one guitar part relative to the other. what was in purple has now gone up in amplitude compared to what was in green. Now, the audio purists in you will be saying that's horrifying because I'm applying a frequency response that looks, I don't know, something like this maybe. But if you actually go and actually have a look at what happens to the spectrum, well, yeah, in terms of the instrument, particularly you'll be horrified because, say for instance, I shouldn't have completely erased it, but if I have, let's just draw two peaks, for instance. I have that in this color, or three peaks, and then I have that one in that color. And now, for argument's sake, let's say I, well, in this case, boost the green one so that it's up to about here somewhere, up to about here. So in terms of if we can deconstruct the mix, what I actually altered in terms of the green spectrum, it ends up looking like whatever, say that. But in terms of the purple spectrum, the effect of the purple spectrum, what the filter did to that, it's gone from that to now being something that looks like and now the purist in you will be horrified and say, I've introduced these peaks that didn't actually exist in the original track. Well, the fundamental reason why that is a non-issue is because if you look at the combined spectrum, what you're actually listening to is the combined mix. So you're hearing this, but you're also hearing the green at the same time. And because the green peaks are so much louder than these, they mask it. So the distortion in the purple track, the distortion of the spectrum in the purple track is masked by the level of the green. So it's the presence of the masking that makes it transparent. So you can make this spectral modification and you don't hear it. The only time you're going to hear it is when they're not playing together. When the two parts aren't playing together, then it'll become more obvious. But that you can deal with via track splitting, for one thing. And the other thing is, obviously, again, like in a tonal instrument like a guitar or something, the level down here in between the two peaks is typically substantially lower than the peak itself, unless you're doing like palm muting or something like that. If you're just playing an open string or playing a stopped string, that is going to be so much lower down anyway, so the chances of you actually raising that to a level where it's actually going to become audible above all the other instruments in your mix is pretty much a non-issue. It's not very likely. Similarly, if you've got a whatever instrument you got in there, you might have a snare drum over the top of it or something like that. Same thing. Like you maybe putting a few peaks into the snare drum spectrum, but because it's masked by the guitar, you don't hear it. Now the main issue, and then the main issue to contend with in terms of remastering that I find is contending with errant dynamics, most notably in vocal parts compared to the rest of the instruments. Like, for instance, it's quite common if you look at, say, I don't know, heavy rock music or something like that, you'll have, say, an average spectrum that might look something like that, and then you'll have the peak spectrum that looks pretty much like that. And invariably, the peak spectrum, if you join the peaks, it won't be completely flat. This is like obviously it's going to be this sort of thing, but basically the trend. If you join the peaks in the spectrum, you'll find that for the peak spectrum, it's pretty much uniform. And for the average spectrum, because in a problematic track, you'll find that the instruments in the most dynamic part of the vocal have been muted so that they don't get buried by the other instruments, because the vocal part is too dynamic compared to the other instruments. So basically the upshot is, if I do a static equalization on that, I end up with these massive peaks here in the vocal part, which are very uncomfortable to listen to. They hurt your ears, basically. And that's why said mastering engineer is not going to equalize it like that to bring the average up, because he can't control these peaks. But in Harbor, I can control these peaks, because all I do is I put a whatever peak taming threshold across there, peak taming threshold across there, and then suddenly if I look at the timeline of that, say I selected this one here, I may end up having one area there, one area there, one area there, or one area there, one area there, or something along the timeline where these peaks occur. So obviously these points in timeline correspond to where the level is above that peak taming threshold, and as a consequence, so if I then go ahead and do my peak taming to bring that down to a normal level, obviously I'm applying a filter response that looks like that, which again you'll say in horror, oh, that's going to distort every other instrument in the mix. But again, the same reason, because the amplitude of the vocal at that point is so much louder than anything else. Even though you're cutting it down in amplitude, it's still, relative to everything else in the mix, it's still so much louder, so it's going to be masking everything else. So it will mask the distortion of the response, the spectral response in the other instruments. The only time it's going to be obvious as an artifact, is if the degree of your spectrum alteration is absolutely massive. Now, I regularly will be doing edits in the order of plus minus 6 dB, plus minus 8 dB, using peak taming, even sometimes 10 dB, without any obvious problem. So with that level of alteration, you can see that that pretty much covers all bases that you're likely to be presented with in terms of a mastering task ahead. If you have to apply more than these sorts of levels of correction, it's obviously going to be a truly atrocious recording, and then maybe you won't expect it to be fixable in the first place. So it's no great loss there. But as it stands, in terms of being able to correct issues, in my CD collection there is only one CD that I have an issue with, that I find it hard to combat in Harbor. Only one. And that's, I don't know, 70 CDs, 80 CDs, God knows. It's a lot. Maybe more. But yeah, I've only ever experienced one situation where it is an issue, and that's fundamentally an issue because of overzealous use of de-essing in a vocal part. And if you want to know which recording I'm referring to, it's basically Midnight Oil, Red Sails in the Sunset. Anybody who's got that recording or have listened to that recording will know immediately that the vocal part in that, the lead vocal part, sounds quite nasally and problematic. And it's basically because there's too much de-essing going on. So you've got strident mid-range in the vocal part, and you've lost all the syllabacy in there. So things start sounding like this, you know, very muffled or whatever. And that combined with the fact that if you've got a hole in the mid-range for the instruments, so then the idea is you want to boost the mid-range in the instruments to bring that up and make it more uniform. Well, obviously doing that to a already muffled vocal is going to make it more muffled, and that's the fundamental dilemma for that recording. It's almost impossible to fix. I wouldn't totally give up hope. I have actually made some inroads on it, but it's a struggle. But anything else I haven't had an issue with. And I'll leave it at that, basically. You can decide for yourself whether I'm talking bullshit or whether indeed my my approaches have merit. But I think you should be able to evaluate that quite easily from the examples I've given, provided Google doesn't block my video.